Now that she is expecting her CEO's child, they secretly married loving in shadows. Twins, hello. Beautiful souls, and welcome back to the channel. I want to start by thanking each and every one of you from the deepest part of my heart for the incredible love and support you've shown. Your feedback, support, and time for the last story are priceless. World to me, and I'm beyond grateful for this amazing community we're building. Before we begin watching the video for today, I would like to take a moment to offer a beautiful prayer for you. May love fill your heart and bring you peace always. Life and bring you happiness, and may you be surrounded by the light of hope and joy each and every day. May all your dreams come true, and may you always know that you are loved beyond measure. Now I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? From what part of the world are you in today? I feel so connected to you all, regardless of where you are. Your experiences and ideas are extremely important to me. And if you haven't already, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You are truly important to me, and together we can continue this beautiful journey. Thank you for being here. And let's begin the story of today. Elena Carter was sitting in the luxurious penthouse, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat as she tried to process the surreal reality. Adrian Sinclair, the vicious billionaire, was unfolding in front of her, across from her. CEO, whose name alone could shake industries, sat with effortless composure. His blue eyes locked onto her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She had always known the world of the elite was different, but nothing had prepared her for this. A marriage contract, a deal that would change the course of her life forever? The room was filled with an eerie silence, the distant hum of New York City barely reaching them through the massive glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. The glittering skyline, so breathtaking from this height, felt like a cruel reminder of how far removed she was from this just a few hours earlier. She had been struggling to keep her in the world of power and luxury. Dreams afloat, working tirelessly to establish herself as a designer while barely scraping by. She had missed out on opportunities and bills, and despite her undeniable talent, the world had continued to push her down, and now sitting in the presence of a man who could change her life with a single stroke of his pen, she was on the verge of an irreversible decision. Adrian leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of absolute authority, his expression unreadable as he watched her with calculating precision. He was a man who never acted on impulse, who measured every move as if the world were a chessboard and he was always 10 steps ahead. But he had chosen her not because she was a socialite or an ace, but because she's a struggling designer with nothing to offer but her name and the promise of discretion. "I need a wife," he stated, his voice smooth, firm, leaving no room for negotiation. His tone carried the weight of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. And for a brief moment, Elena wondered if anyone had ever dared to refuse him. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she stared at the marriage. The contract, neatly placed between them on the polished black table, seemed to be a subtle reminder to her. She murmured more to indicate that she was about to make a decision that would forever alter the course of her life, herself rather than to him, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. His business arrangement never wavered, and he voiced his correction without emotion. "In an exchange, you will have complete financial freedom to pursue your career and access to resources that would otherwise take you years to obtain." Although the offer seemed almost too good to be true, Elena couldn't turn it down. Goring, feeling in her gut, this wasn't just a contract, it was a life sentence. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the question hanging between them like an unspoken challenge. Adrian didn't flinch. "Because I trust you," he said simply, as if that alone should be enough to silence her doubts. But trust was a term that people used carelessly, a word she had learned to be wary of all her life, fighting for a place in a world that had always told her she wasn't good enough and that she didn't belong. Now she's fighting for a place. This man, this powerful, untouchable billionaire, was telling her that he trusted her. "It didn't make sense. You barely knew me," she said, forcing herself to keep looking at me as, "Despite the fact that you want to marry," her pulse pounded in her ears. I caught a glimpse of something unreadable in his eye before she vanished. "Could understand it, but I don't have time for emotional problems," he replied. It's a simple
Voice
exchange,
steady
as
as
ever.
ever.
Nothing about
This
this
is
felt
strictly
simple.
business. You need security.
Marriage was supposed to be
I need
about
a wife.
love, about commitment, about two people deciding to live together because they couldn't imagine a world without one another. But this was a transaction, a deal sealed with a signature, rather than a vow of devotion. Despite the fact that she had barely made it through the previous year, she had no choice. Watching her dreams get further and further out of reach as the relentless weight of reality crushed her, this was a chance to finally breathe, to finally live without having to worry about the next bill, missed opportunity, failure, or all she had to do was accept it from Adrian Sinclair on a platter. Was to say yes, and as she reached for the pen that was resting beside her fingers trembled. Contract as if it were a silent promise of the cool metal pressing against her skin. Future she was about to walk into. This wasn't just a signature. This was surrender. This was stepping into a world where love had no place, where emotions, where the man she would call her husband would never be hers, were liabilities the way that really mattered. But she signed okay. As she forced herself to meet Adrian's gaze, she whispered the word, "I'll do it," his lips, barely escaping her lips, curved into the faintest smirk, a response that was so insignificant yet so telling of him. Expected this, he had known she would agree. "Good," he said, standing with effortless grace as he buttoned his suit jacket. "We marry tomorrow." Tomorrow, the word echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of how little time she had to process the lack of a long-term engagement and no time to prepare. No time to escape. She was about to become Miss Adrian Sinclair, a man she barely knew, a man who didn't believe in love, a man whose presence alone made her breath catch and her pulse race for reasons she refused to acknowledge. As she rose to her feet, she felt his gaze follow her, an unspoken weight settling between them. He had won, this was his game, and she had just become another carefully placed piece on his board. But as she walked toward the elevator, her heart pounding, a single thought burned in her mind. Would this decision save her or destroy her? Because something about Adrian Sinclair told her that this was not just a deal. This was the beginning of something she would never be able to control. The wedding was nothing like Elena had imagined. No grand hall filled with flowers, no music playing softly in the background, no long aisle to walk down as guests watched with teary eyes, no flowing white dress, no bouquet in her hands, no nervous EXC excitement or whispered congratulations. Instead, it was a quiet clinical affair held in the office of a private judge where vows were exchanged in hushed tones, a signature was placed on the marriage certificate. And just like that, she became Mrs. Adrian Sinclair. There was no moment of celebration, no embrace or lingering kiss, just a businesslike handshake from the judge and the rustling of papers being filed away. Elena stood there in her simple beige dress, feeling both like a bride and a stranger. In her own story, she stole a glance at Adrian, who remained unreadable. His suit impeccable, his stance composed. He had barely looked at her since the moment they had stepped into the courthouse. And now as they walked out together into the cool evening air, she felt more alone than ever. She had thought that marriage, even one built on a contract, would feel different, that perhaps something inside her would shift, that the weight of the commitment would settle into her bones. But as she slid into the back seat of his sleek black car, watching the city lights blur past through the tinted windows, she realized that nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Adrian sat beside her, silent, his focus on his phone, his fingers scrolling through messages with the same disinterest he had shown throughout the day, if not for the golden. With his wedding band now resting on his left hand, no one would have known he was married until he realized it. Made Elena's stomach tighten. To the world they were strangers, but behind closed doors it was a different story. She turned slightly, studying his profile, the sharp angle of his jaw, the way his lashes cast faint shadows over his cheekbones. There was a tension in his shoulders that were not obvious, but were there, like a man carrying a weight that no one could see. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the suffocating silence between them, but the words refused to come. Instead, she shifted her gaze back to the window, trying to focus on the blur of neon signs and headlights, instead of the unsettling presence beside her. When they arrived at his penthouse, Elena stepped inside her, breath catching as she took Windows framed the entire city and the breathtaking view from the floor up. The skyline sparkled against them, stretching out beneath them like a living, breathing masterpiece. The soft glow of the buildings reflecting in the glass, making the space feel endless. It was the kind of place she had only ever seen in magazines, sleek, modern, and exuding quiet luxury, but it wasn't the marble floors or the designer furniture that made her pulse quicken. It was him she turned. Adrian was standing a few steps away, his jacket already thrown away, and his fingers had fallen off. He really looked at her after untying the silk tie around his neck and looking at her. Her and the intensity in his gaze made her stomach flip. It was the first time since the ceremony in which he acknowledged her presence in more than just words, and the significance of that his voice said, "We may be married on paper." Her attention sent a chill down her spine. Low and smooth, but we have rules, he stepped closer. His movements unhurried, controlled as if we were evaluating her reaction in the workplace. We are merely employers. An employee, no one can know his tone, left no room for argument, and Elena found herself nodding automatically, her throat suddenly dry. And here she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A slow, dangerous smirk played at the corner of his lips, one that sent heat curling through her veins. Here he murmured, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering just long enough to make her heart stutter. We don't have to pretend. The air between them shifted heavy with something unspoken, something that had been lurking beneath the surface since the day he had proposed this arrangement. Elena felt her pulse quicken her body, reacting before her mind could catch up. This was dangerous. He was dangerous. And yet as he took another step closer, the distance between them got smaller. She couldn't bring herself to move away from his fresh, masculine scent. He had always exuded power, as a hint of cedar surrounded her, always carried himself with the confidence of a man who was used to having the world at his feet. But here in this moment, there was something else in his gaze, something raw, something that made her knees weak. She didn't move as he reached for her, his fingers skimming down her arm in a touch so light it sent a shiver racing through her. He was testing the waters, seeing how far she would let him go. And God help her. She didn't want to stop him. Adrian, she started, but the word barely made it past her lips before he silenced her with a look. You knew what this deal entailed, Elena. He murmured, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate path along the inside of her wrist. You knew what you were agreeing to. She swallowed hard, her mind screaming at her to say something, to remind him that this was supposed to be a business arrangement. But her body had already betrayed her. She had told herself she wouldn't get caught up in this, that she would keep her emotions locked away, that this marriage wouldn't mean anything. But standing here, with Adrian's hands on her skin, with his gaze burning into hers like a promise, she knew she was already in trouble, because what had started as a deal was starting to feel real, too real, and she wasn't sure she would be able to survive. Elena ought to have known better from the time she signed the marriage contract. Contract she had promised herself she wouldn't let emotions complicate things. She had drawn lines, set boundaries in her mind, convinced herself that this arrangement was nothing but a means to an end. And yet as she stood in Adrian's lavish penthouse, watching the man she had just married loosen his tie roll, back his sleeves, and pour himself a glass of whiskey, with effortless confidence, she felt her heart pound against her ribs. It was an unfamiliar sensation. This rapid thumping, this when he was near, she had a restless energy that ran through her veins. Supposed to feel this way, she wasn't supposed to want him, but the truth had a way of creeping up on her, undeniable and consuming. Adrian turned toward her, the amber liquid swirling in his glass, as his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. There was something unreadable in his, a gloomy object, with the knowledge that he could see straight through the carefully crafted facade she was frantically attempting to maintain. Your trepidation, he observed, voice deep and smooth, carrying across the spacious room with a quiet authority that made her shiver. Elena straightened. She lied every word, shrugging her shoulders and refusing to falter in her attempt to meet his gaze. Escaping her lips with practiced ease, a slow, knowing smirk curved his lips as he took a step in her direction, his steps deliberate and deliberate, like those of a predator. Closing in on its prey, good, he murmured, his voice dropping lower. because there's no reason to be, but there was, because no matter how many times she told herself that this marriage was just a contract, no matter how hard she tried to hide the awareness that was coursing through their relationship, was impossible to ignore. The chemistry had been there from the start, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite, and now standing here alone with him in his penthouse, where the city lights cast long shadows across the room, gave the impression that the entire world had shrunk down to just the two of them. She turned away, needing a moment to steady her breath, to remind herself why she was here, why she couldn't afford to let emotions complicate things. But before she could regain her composure, she was so close to him, behind her, that she could feel his warmth. Presence, the subdued dominance that he exuded without even attempting, and her body's tense awareness. Elena's name rolled off his tongue as it prickled along her skin, like a quiet command making her breath hitch. His voice was lower now, more intimate, more dangerous. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to turn and face. His gaze was fixed on her, her heart pounding against her rib cage. "Are you afraid of me?" Unflinching in her search for something she was unsure she could offer, she whispered, but the words spread. Too fast, too breathless. Something flickered in his eyes, desire, curiosity. He whispered something more profoundly beneficial, and before she could think of all the reasons why this was a bad idea, she felt the warmth of his fingers tilt her chin up, and then his lips were on hers. The world melted. The first time he kissed her, he took his time, as if he were enjoying the taste of her, without being impatient or demanding. Instead, he kissed her like he had all the time in the world, like he was claiming her, in a way that was more dangerous than any words he could ever say. His lips moved against hers with used, gentle coaxing and teasing, until she gasped against his mouth, which was all it took. The moment she parted her lips, the moment she surrendered to the fire burning between them. Adrian deepened the kiss, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against him, his body a solid wall of heat and strength, his hands traced down her back, his touch firm, possessive, as if he had been eagerly anticipating this moment, just as long as she had. Elena felt her fingers tangle in his shirt, gripping onto him as if he were the only thing keeping her grounded. She wasn't thinking about the contract anymore. She wasn't thinking about rules or boundaries, or the consequences of crossing this line. All she could think about was him, the way his lips moved against hers, the way his hands explored, his breath intertwined with the curves of her body, as if he had memorized every. Hers was warm and intoxicating, and she ought to have stopped. She ought to have pulled away, which would have reminded him that this was not part of the agreement, that this was dangerous territory neither of them should be treading, but instead she should allow herself to sink further and lose herself in the way he felt about her. Adrian paused just long enough to whisper her name as he kissed her lips. Breath warm his voice. "Roar, Elena." She looked up at him, her eyes glazed with heat, her lips swollen from his kiss, and in that moment she knew that no matter how much they tried to keep this marriage professional, no matter how many times they told themselves that this was just a contract, this whatever it was between them was beyond their control. And when Adrian lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward his bedroom, Elena had never felt this way before. Lying in the soft silk sheets of Adrian's massive bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't control the heat of last night still lingered on her skin. Her body burned with the memory of his touch like an intoxicating dream. Still ached in the most delicious way. Every inch of her, reminded of the way he had claimed her, worshipped her, made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. But as the golden morning light filtered through the enormous windows of his penthouse, heavy and suffocating, this wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to fall into. Adrian was lying next to her in his bed, and when she turned her head, she saw his face. Relaxed, his breathing, deep and steady. He looked different in sleep, softer, almost vulnerable. The usual sharpness in his features, the cold, calculated air he carried during the day was gone. Instead, he looked peaceful, beautiful. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she allowed herself to take him in, to memorize the way his dark lashes contrasted against his sculpted cheekbones. The way his lips, the same ones that had kissed her senseless last night, were slightly parted. Her fingers itched to trace the strong lines of his jaw, to feel his skin's warmth between her fingers. But she didn't. She couldn't, because what happened last night had been a mistake. A beautiful, intoxicating, irrevocable mistake. This was supposed to be a contract, a business arrangement, a facade. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let emotions get in the way, that she would keep her heart locked away, safe from a man who had made it abundantly clear that he did not believe in love. But last night, in the midst of passion, she had forgotten everything. Forgotten the rules, forgotten the consequences. She had let herself fall into his arms, into his bed, as if this were real, as if he truly belonged to her. She tried to suppress the deep ache of longing that was tangled in her chest of guilt, but this was not real and never could be. Carefully, she slipped out from beneath the covers, biting her lip when Adrian stirred slightly, a deep sigh escaping his lips before he settled again. Moving quietly, she grabbed the silk robe draped over the chair and wrapped it tightly around herself, as if that could protect her from the mess she had made. She needed some breathing room. She turned toward the door, but before she could take a step, Adrian's deep, sleep-laced voice sent a shiver down her spine. Elna slowly froze and turned to face him, pulse hammering as she met his gaze. He was awake now, those piercing blue eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her knees weak. His voice was husky, rough from sleep, but the way he said her name, it sent a wave of heat crashing over her all over again. But she couldn't do this. She couldn't let herself hope. I need to get ready for work," she murmured, forcing herself to look away for a moment. Adrian just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then finally he nodded, "All right." She turned quickly, leaving before she could change her mind, before she could do something reckless, like crawl back into bed and lose herself in him all over again. 2 weeks later, Elena stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her hands trembling as she stared down at the pregnancy test. Positive her breath hitched number no. This couldn't be happening. Her vision blurred as she gripped the edge of the sink, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might shatter. The white plastic stick in her hand might as well have been a ticking time bomb. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to escape this nightmare. But when she opened them again, she found 2 dark pink lines were still there. Undeniable, a strangled sound left her lips as she stumbled back, sinking onto the closed toilet lid. Her fingers was tightening around the test until her knuckles turned white. She and Adrian had only been together once one night, but it had been enough. A sob bubbled in her throat as reality crashed down on her. She was pregnant with his child number. The doctor's words from earlier reverberated in her head, not just one child, twin, sending another wave of shock through her 2 babies. Her heart clenched. How was she supposed to tell Adrian their marriage wasn't real? It was a contract. He had made it abundantly clear from the beginning that he had never desired a family, let alone emotional complications. What would happen if he didn't want them? What would happen if he thought this pregnancy was just an inconvenience? Tears burned in her eyes as fear coiled tightly around her chest. She had no idea how Adrian would react to this. Would he push? He was powerful, controlled, and completely unreadable. Push her away? Would he demand she get rid of the babies? A sharp pain stabbed through her heart at the thought, and she wouldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let anyone take them from her. But what if she was wrong? What if for the first time Adrian surprised her? She placed a trembling hand over her flat stomach, trying to process the life growing inside her, the 2 tiny heartbeats that already meant more to her than anything else. But she knew one thing: couldn't keep this secret forever, because soon Adrian Sinclair would find out that their one night of passion had led to something life-changing. Elena had never been good at keeping secrets. She had always been the type to wear her emotions on her sleeve, to speak before thinking she was being painfully honest when she shouldn't have been. But this was different. This was a secret that she had that could alter everything for 2 weeks. Walked into the office pretending her world hadn't been turned upside down, keeping up the facade that nothing was wrong. Nothing had changed, but deep down everything had changed. Every glance in the mirror was a stark reminder that she wasn't just Elena Carter, the ambitious designer who had signed a marriage contract with a billionaire. She was now Elena Carter Sinclair, carrying the She had promised herself that she would wait for the children of a man who did not believe in love, that she would find the right moment, the perfect words. But as each day passed, she was weighed down with the truth like an iron cage, caught between fear and responsibility. Adrian say, what would he do? Would he be furious? Would he feel betrayed? Or worse, would he feel nothing at all? The thought made her chest tighten. She had spent the past 2 weeks moving carefully around him, careful not to meet his gaze for too long, careful not to linger in his presence at work that was beyond the call of duty, and her responses to his emails, with the efficiency of an employee, not a wife at home. She made excuses to stay in her room longer, pretending to be buried in work or exhausted from the day. It was a delicate balance, a game of distance and avoidance. But she should have known better. Adrian Sinclair wasn't a man who let things slip past him, and now she was standing at the edge of a breaking point at the office. Elna, her name cut through the silence like a knife. She looked up from her desk just as Adrian stepped out of his office, even without saying much. He had a way of commanding attention, the power in his stance, the way his sharp blue eyes. He was a man who never asked for anything twice and rightly pinned her in place. He was now looking at her as though he knew something wasn't right. Wasn't a question, it was a fact. Elena swallowed, forcing a polite smile. I'm just busy. His expression didn't change, but his gaze darkened slightly as if he didn't quite believe her really. His voice was unreadable smooth, yet firm the way it always was when he was picking apart a lie. She gripped the pen in her hand, willing herself to stay composed. But before she could think of a response, he moved 1 second. He was standing near his office door the next. He was right there, towering over her desk, close enough that she could clearly smell him, the woodsy, clean scent of his perfume. Scent sent an uninvited shiver down her spine. You've been avoiding me, he murmured, her breath caught in her throat. He was too close, too perceptive. Even though she knew she had lied, she could still hear how weak it sounded as a muscle twitched. His jaw. You forget who you're talking to. Mrs. Sinclair, her stomach twisted at the way he pronounced her name, Mrs. Sinclair, evoked an odd mix of feelings. Flooding through her, she was his wife in name and contract, in legal document that bound them together but not in heart, or at least he didn't think so. If he knew what she was hiding, would that change? She forced herself to meet his Adrian. I just need some space. There was a long, silent pause between them. His blue eyes looked into hers like they were trying to read. Between the lines of her carefully controlled expression, he figured it out was that why he was pushing for answers. Then finally he exhaled, stepping back. Fine, he said. But there was something in his voice, something restrained, something controlled. He was giving her space, but it wasn't without cost. Space won't change what's between us. His voice was quiet, but the weight of those words pressed against her chest like an unspoken promise. Her heart pounded. Did he know? Number impossible. Adrian held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded. Come home early tonight, he said, turning to leave. We need. Elena's hands trembled as she entered Adriana's penthouse that evening, her heart pounding violently against her. To talk her stomach into knots, he never asked. Ribs. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt it, the unmistakable tension in the air, thick and suffocating like a storm gathering strength. The walls of the luxurious space seemed to close in around her. She had kept the truth from him for an excessive amount of time, escalating the anxiety she had been feeling for weeks, and now there was no more hiding. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her handbag as she took slow, hesitant steps forward. The penthouse was eerily silent. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked out the window, apart from the faint hum of the city beyond. Spotted him standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his tall, imposing figure. His broad shoulders were tense, outlined by the evening skyline's golden hues. His strong posture rigid, his jacket had been discarded, and the sleeves of his crisp white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing the defined muscles of his forearms. He looked composed, effortless as always. Yet she knew better. He was waiting for her. A shiver ran down her spine, forcing herself to advance with each step that felt heavier than the last. This was it, the moment she had dreaded and rehearsed over and over in her mind. Yet nothing could prepare her for what was about to come. She sucked in a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian, his name left her lips like a plea, but he didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he remained facing the glass, his hands still in his pockets, exuding a quiet dominance that made the air around them feel charged for several long, agonizing seconds. He said nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, with secrets she had buried too deep. Then finally his voice cut through the stillness, deep and smooth, yet carrying an edge that sent shivers down her spine. Elena caught her breath as he slowly turned his back, icy blue eyes locking onto hers, sharp and unreadable. His expression was controlled too. Controlled, but beneath the polished exterior, she could smell something simmering. Suspicion, calculation, analyzing her every move. "You've been distant," he stated, his voice calm, yet filled with quiet intensity. "You've been hiding something." Elena's pulse spiked. He knew maybe not everything, but he knew something was off. She could see it in the way his gaze narrowed slightly, in the way he studied her, as if he could see right through her carefully crafted facade. Her throat felt dry, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She had practiced this moment in her head 1,000 times, had imagined every possible reaction he could have, every possible outcome. But under the weight of his piercing gaze as she stood before him, she was terrified. "I want the truth." Adrian continued, his voice low, unwavering. A sharp exhale left her lips. No more running, her stomach twisted painfully as she finally whispered the words that would change everything. "I'm pregnant." The confession hung in the air like a bomb for a moment. There was nothing but silence, absolute silence. Adrian didn't move, didn't blink, his expression remained unreadable. But something in his posture shifted, something subtle, yet unmistakable. Elena's heart pounded as she watched his face, carefully bracing for his reaction. Would he be angry? Would he think she had betrayed him? Would he walk away, tell her this change? Nothing between them. Finally, after what felt like an atoll, his lips parted. His voice when he spoke was dangerously low. "Say that again." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I'm pregnant." "Adrian?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't look away. He deserved to hear everything from the twins, and he let out a sharp breath. Expression remained unreadable, but she saw it, the flicker of something raw, something undeniably intense in his gaze. His jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides seemed to be trying to process the weight of her words. She expected him to scream and ask why she hadn't told him. Him sooner, to tell her she had made a mistake by keeping this from him. But what she didn't expect was the way he crossed the room in 3 powerful strides, cued her face in his strong hands, and crashed his lips onto hers. Elena gasped against his mouth, completely unprepared for the sheer possessiveness in his kiss. His lips were firm, demanding, yet there was something deeper beneath it, a desperation, a need that sent her head spinning. "You're carrying my children," he murmured against her lips, his voice husky, filled with something primal. She shivered. Yes, his. As if he needed to feel her, he pulled her against him as he tightened his grip on her and reached down to her waist. Assure himself that this was real, that she was real mine. He whispered the single word, filled with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You and the mine." Tears burned in her eyes. She had been so afraid that he would push her away, that he would tell her this changed nothing, that their contract remained the same, that she was merely a woman who had happened to get pregnant, but instead he was claiming her. Adrian pulled back slightly, his blue eyes full of something she'd never seen before, something almost possessive and protective, reverent. "You should have told me sooner," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. His hold on her tightened. "Never be scared of me, Elena." His forehead pressed against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I will take care of you, of them, of us." Her heart clenched painfully. This wasn't just a contract anymore. This wasn't just about a calculated arrangement or signatures on paper. This was real, and there was no turning back. Elna had always known that Adrian Sinclair was a powerful, not only was he wealthy, but he was also a controlling individual. Attention. The second he stepped into a room, the kind of man whose sharp blue eyes could freeze a person in place, with people bowed to his demands and rushed to meet his expectations with a single glance. He was so desperate for his approval that he never had to speak in his own presence. Was enough to shape the world around him. He was used to power control and total control over his life in every way, something she never anticipated. What she never could have prepared for was what happened after he found out she was pregnant. He didn't just take responsibility, he claimed her, and he became possessive, protective, and overwhelmingly, inescapably obsessed. The next morning, Elena slowly awoke, body sinking into the warmth. Surrounding her, the air in the penthouse was cool, but she felt nothing but heat wrapped in something soft, safe, and undeniably intimate. Her limbs were heavy, her mind was foggy, and her breathing was slow and steady as she drifted between sleep and wakefulness. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, but then, as her senses sharpened, she became acutely aware of the heavy, muscular arm draped over her waist, the steady rise and fall of the strong chest pressed against her back, the unmistakable presence of Adrian. Her breath-hitched reality came rushing back the night before his reaction. The way he had looked at her after she told him she was pregnant, the way his lips had crashed onto hers with a desperation she still didn't fully understand, the way he had whispered mine. And now she was wrapped in his arms, tangled in his bed, completely claimed. Her heart pounded violently. She had to move. She had to create distance before this went any further, before she let herself sink deeper into the dangerous comfort of his embrace. She had spent weeks trying to keep a boundary between them, convincing herself that their marriage was nothing more than a business deal that the lines between them could never blur. But she shifted slightly in an effort to escape from the place, now that everything had changed. Under his arm, but the second she moved, his grip tightened. Don't a shiver ran down her spine at the sound of his voice. Deep, husky, thick with sleep. That voice, that tone. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. Low, possessive, filled with something unspoken. Elena froze. She felt his breath against her neck, slow and controlled, as if he were still half asleep, but unwilling to let her go. He wasn't awake yet, at least not fully, but even in his sleep, his instincts demanded that she stay exactly where she was. Her stomach fluttered, not just from his touch, but from the life growing inside her. Their babies. Adrian's hand slid down from his palm, was large and warm, gracing the curve of her stomach before resting there with gentle pressure. Steady, protective, and assertive. I still can't believe it, he murmured as Elena slightly tilted her head. Finding him already awake, his piercing blue eyes watching her with an unreadable expression, there was something in his gaze, something raw, something that made her breath catch in her throat, believe what she asked softly. His fingers flexed slightly against her stomach, his thumb brushing over the fabric of her nightgown, as if he needed the physical confirmation that my children are in there. He murmured then, softer, almost reverently, that you're mine. Elena's pulse skyrocketed. This wasn't the Adrian Sinclair, who with cold logic and calculated detachment had proposed a contract marriage. Wasn't the man who had once told her their relationship would never be real. This man, the one holding her, touching her like she was his entire world, was different. Her lips parted. Her Adrian's breath was uneven. We said this marriage wouldn't be real. Instantaneously, his jaw tightened at the sight of a dangerous flash. Through his gaze, do you still believe that, he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Since the moment she told him, everything had changed, so she did not hesitate. Was pregnant. Something inside of him had changed, and he could now feel it. His words, his possessive gaze that refused to look anywhere but at her. Before she could answer, he suddenly shifted his lips, brushing against her temple in a gesture so tender it left her breathless. And then his firm, commanding voice said, I don't want you. Overwork, Elena frowned, startled by the sudden change in topic. I'm fine, you're pregnant. He counted smoothly with my twins. His hand caressed her stomach. You're not even putting in a hand motion at work, his gaze darkening once more. I can still perform my duties, Adrian, even with her brows furrowed. Elena sat up slightly, pulling, as his expression hardened. Away just enough to fully examine him, Adrian sat up and extended one arm. You can't just decide that for me. Supporting him, Elena had no idea that Adrian Sinclair, the ruthless CEO of the Untouchables, would one day become clingy. He was a man known for his cold deficiency, a man who built he was feared throughout empire with a sharp mind and even sharper tongue. Corporate world admired by competitors and practically worried by his employees. He didn't waste time on his feelings. He didn't let personal issues affect his business, and he didn't get attached. It had only been one day since he found out about her pregnancy, and already he had taken complete control of her life. When she awoke, it wasn't just a minor shift. It was a complete and overwhelming one that she hadn't anticipated. A breakfast that was recommended by a nutritionist, a personal driver who was waiting to take her wherever she wanted, and Adrian checking every 5 minutes as if she were made of glass. And the worst part is that he wasn't even subtle about it. He watched and controlled from a distance. Obsessed, and now as she stepped into Sinclair Corporation, the company where she had spent years proving herself, she realized that Adrian's overprotectiveness had spread into her professional life as well. Elna walked through the grand entrance of Sinclair Corporation, her heels clicking against the polished on the marble floor. She raised her head in an effort to act as though nothing had happened. Changed, she was still the company's chief strategist. She was still one of Adrian's most trusted employees, or at least she had been before he learned about the twins. As soon as she entered, something seemed different from the usual hum. The office's murmured conversations, keyboard clicks, and phone ringing went quieter after that. She noticed it. Everyone was staring at her. She frowned, her gaze flickering. Employees were whispering behind their hands across the room. A few of them gave each other nervous glances, and others appeared downright terrified, as if something catastrophic had happened. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. What the hell was going? As she moved faster toward her office, she suddenly stopped in her tracks. Her usual workspace, where she had worked for many hours, was now her desk. The paper she had left behind had vanished, and her plans for resolving the company's most pressing issues had vanished as well. Computer was inaccessible, and the entire room had been cleared out as though she had. She felt a sharp wave of disbelief when she realized what the actual hell. As she turned around looking for answers, her heart rate increased, and that's when she nearly collided with the very man responsible for this madness. Adrian Sinclair was perfectly composed as he stood there, his dark blue suit standing out against his crisp white shirt. Hands were casually tucked into his pockets, and a far too pleased smirk curled at his lips. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, filled with something dangerous: possession, amusement, satisfaction. Elena's heart pounded, a mixture of frustration and something far more dangerous. She crossed her arms. Adrian, where is my desk? His smirk deepened. You don't need it. She blinked once, twice. Her jaw practically dropped. Please excuse me. But his gaze never wavered, and was filled with an unshakable authority. You're pregnant, he said smoothly, as if that explained everything. Elena stared blankly at him, thinking that he couldn't be serious. Adrian, you can't just fire me. His lips twitched, as if barely restraining his amusement. I didn't fire you. He tilted his head slightly, eyes gleaming. I promoted me to what his smirk turned into an infuriatingly smug smile. Promoted you, she frowned. My wife heat flooded her cheeks. That was not an answer. That's not a job, Adrian, she snapped, exasperation lacing her voice. His expression didn't change. It is. He took a deliberate, slow step forward to close the door before she could argue. Space between them, the office suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, heavier, his scent fresh and intoxicating, overwhelmingly masculine and distracting around her. In ways that shouldn't be your new responsibility, he murmured. Getting lower means she can relax, eat well, and let me spoil her stomach. She turned her head and narrowed her eyes. Adrian, this is insane. You're carry my children. He counted, so you shouldn't be worried about it. Work. Elena sighed and pressed her fingers against the man's temples. Impossible, Adrian. I want to work. He sighed dramatically, as if she were the one being unreasonable. Fine, he said, his voice laced with mock surrender. She felt relieved for a brief moment before he pulled out his phone and called, and she heard him say, hire a full team of assistants to handle, within seconds. Elena's workload effective immediately, her eyes widened. Adrian, he ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. Problem solved, her frustration boiled over. Are you serious? She demanded. Adrian's smirk returned dead serious. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. What was she even supposed to say to that? He re-enclosed his hands, pockets watching her with that maddeningly smug, arrogant, impossibly attractive expression. You can still come. As if he were being generous, he said to the office, only if you promise to sit in my office and rest on the couch, and permit me to care for you. Her breath hitched her. Adrian Sinclair, the man who had once insisted their marriage was nothing more than a contract, which was now completely obsessive and impossible to break. Devoted Adrian Elena, he stepped in between steps even closer, to the point where she could feel his warmth and react to him in ways that betrayed her. Wished it wouldn't. His large hand gently pressed against her stomach, his touch. Warm, firm, unwavering, his fingers sped slightly as if trying to feel the life growing inside her, as if grounding himself in the reality that she carried his babies. Elena had always, Adrian Sinclair, was known to be a powerful man, a natural force, and a commander. Every room he entered, his mere presence exuding dominance, control, and he was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, and he possessed unshakable authority that made others tremble. A man feared him, by his enemies, respected by his employees, and admired by women who would do anything to capture even a fraction of his attention. He was untouchable, unreachable, until the day when she became his wife. She had hoped that he would treat their union like a contract and not more. Arrangement without emotions, but what she hadn't expected was for him to. Adrian was no longer her greatest weakness as time went on, and everything changed. Longer just the ruthless CEO she had married, he was everywhere. His presence suffocated but intoxicated her throughout her life. He was the man who held her close at night, whispering into her skin that she was overpowering and addicted to him. Belonged to him, that she was his wife, the mother of his children, his obsession. He was the man who touched her stomach reverently, as if the life growing inside her was the most precious, as though she were the most valuable thing in the world. And above all, he was the man who wouldn't let her lift a single damn finger at the penthouse. Elena, Adrian's deep, commanding voice called from the kitchen. She rolled her eyes. Here we go again. She knew that tone, the overprotective, controlling, possessive tone, the one that meant he had caught her doing something he didn't approve of. Seconds later, he appeared in the doorway, arms crossed over his broad chest, his navy blue shirt unbuttoned at the collar sleeves, rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, veined hands that had spent far too much time cradling her stomach as if it were porcelain. His sharp blue eyes were fixed on her, praying intently. Gaze dropped to the glass in her hand. I told you not to stand for too long, he scolded, his tone tinged with anger. Elena sighed and set the glass down on him. The counter, Adrian. I was just getting water. He took slow, measured steps toward her. And where are the butlers I hired? She arched an eyebrow. Probably hiding because they're terrified of you. His lips twitched. The bastard was amused. Good, she groaned, dragging a hand down her face. There was no reasoning with this man. Adrian, I'm pregnant, not fragile. His door clenched. That was the wrong thing to say. His blue eyes, you're carrying my twins, darkened a storm brewing within them. Elena, the way he said it, low, possessive, dripping with fierce protectiveness, sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. Before she could react, before she could argue, Adrian suddenly scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. A startled gasp escaped her lips. Adrian, put me down. No, his grip tightened around her, unyielding, unshakable. His scent surrounded her, clean and masculine, mixed with the faintest hint of the cologne she was beginning to associate with safety. He carried her effortlessly to the couch. He moved effortlessly, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. If holding her in his arms was where she was always meant to be, gently, he placed her down, making sure Elena looked at him as she knelt beside her. She was content. Breath caught in her throat. Adrian Sinclair didn't kneel for anyone. His large, warm hands found her stomach, and then softly, almost reverently, he touched her. You don't understand, do you? He murmured, voice lower now. Elena swallowed. Understand what? She quietly asked. His tone sent chills down her spine. His fingers caressed her stomach, slow, gentle movements, as if he were memorizing the shape of their unborn children. When he lifted his gaze to meet hers, she saw something raw in his expression. Something vulnerable. I can't lose you. Her heart stopped. Adrian Sinclair, there, the man who built an empire with ruthless, the man who never let anyone see his flaws, precision, was looking at her as if she were his entire world. The air shifted. Everything shifted. I've spent my life building an empire. Elena, he murmured, his fingers continuing their slow caress. But none of it matters not if I don't have you. Her chest ached. He meant it. This wasn't an act. This wasn't just some possessive, overprotective CEO controlling his wife. This was something deeper, real, consuming love. Her lips trembled. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared for him. Elena, his voice was softer now, almost pleading. He reached for her hand, pressing a slow, lingering kiss to her palm, his lips warm against her skin. His gaze burned into hers. Tell me your mind, her breath caught. He had asked this before so many times, but this time was different. This time, it wasn't a demand. This time it was a request, a plea. She wanted to say it. She wanted to fall completely, to let herself believe. This wasn't just obsession, wasn't just some twisted need to control her. It was love, that he loved her, that he wasn't just claiming her because of the babies, but because of her. But could she risk it? Could she risk her heart on Adrian Sinclair, the man who had once told her their marriage would never be real? The man who was now looking at her as if he couldn't breathe without her, as he pressed his lips to her stomach, murmuring words of devotion to the twins inside her, as his fingers traced gentle circles against her skin, as his entire body seemed to melt against hers in a silent vow. Now, forever, she came to the conclusion that perhaps it was already too late. Adrian Sinclair had always been a possessive man. It wasn't just a part of his nature. It was ingrained in his very existence, the way he operated, the way he lived. He didn't like sharing what was his, and he especially couldn't tolerate the idea of another man being anywhere near Elena. It had always been there, this primal protective instinct. But now that she was carrying his twins, his possessiveness had evolved into something even more dangerous. It was no longer just an urge to keep her close. It was an obsession, a relentless AOC consuming need to make sure no other man even so much as breathed in her direction. And today someone was about to test just how far that jealousy went at the office. Elle knew Adrian was overprotective, controlling, and maddeningly unreasonable when it came to her well-being. She had seen him hover like a shadow, had felt his hands constantly guiding her away from anything he deemed too dangerous, which in his mind was practically everything. But she hadn't realized just how bad it had gotten until she stepped into an important business meeting that morning. A meeting with one of their most, from the moment Elena entered the conference, valuable clients, was a male client room. Daniel Carter, the CEO of a billion-dollar tech firm, rose to his feet. He was charming, polished, and exuded the easy confidence of a man who was used to winning. He smiled as soon as he saw her, and Mrs. Sinclair Daniel was graciously greeted. Extending a hand toward her, "It's always a pleasure." Elena returned the smile, already reaching to shake his hand out of sheer professionalism, but before she could make contact, before her fingertips could even touch his palm, as a firm, unwavering grip abruptly wrapped around him. Around her wrist, she gasped softly, startled by the firm, possessive hold. Before she could react, before she could even turn her head, a tall, towering presence stepped between them, effectively obstructing Daniel's view of Adrian, whose relaxed posture, his energy was deadly, and his icy blue eyes were fixed on Daniel like a prey animal. Surveying his prey, and his grip on Elena's wrist was firm, but not enough to hurt, just enough to make it very clear that he was in control. "Mr. Carter," Adrian said smoothly, his voice calm, but there was an unmistakable warning underneath the surface. "I don't believe you need to touch my wife to conduct business." Elena inhaled sharply. "Oh no," Daniel raised a brow, clearly amused by Adrian's reaction. Adrian's sharp jaw clenched, and "Adrian, I was just being polite." Something dark flickered behind his gaze. His wife, his pregnant wife, the woman carrying his twins. Adrian didn't believe in coincidences, and he certainly didn't believe in men smiling at his wife like that. Elena felt the tension spike in the room, the air thick with unspoken hostility. She knew Adrian knew that look in his eyes, knew the way his entire body tensed when he was restraining himself from doing something irrational. She sighed in frustration. He was being ridiculous. Adrian, seriously, she muttered under her breath, glancing up at him with an exasperated look. But her husband was completely unfazed instead of backing down. His hand slowly slid from her wrist to her lower back in an intentional possessive gesture. Then without Elena took a deep breath after he hesitated and pulled her close to him. Her cheeks flaming with heat. "Darling," Adrian murmured, his lips dangerously. Nearby, Adrian Sinclair had mastered control his entire life. Greatest weapon, his most trusted shield. He had built an empire with his cold, old, calculated decisions, never allowing emotions to cloud his judgment. No weakness, no vulnerabilities, only he possessed absolute power over everything and everyone in his vicinity. That was how he ruled the world. But when it came to Elena, that control shattered. He was no longer the ruthless, untouchable CEO who stood above the rest. Adrian changed from the man who made others tremble at the sight of him to something else when it came to her. Entirely something raw, something desperate, something utterly and hopelessly in love. And tonight the whole world would see it, the gala night, the Sinclair Corporation's annual charity. The gala was the year's most exclusive event, a night on which the most powerful figures in the world gathered. Billionaires, politicians, CEOs, and celebrities. All under one roof, deals worth millions were made here, alliances. The night was supposed to be one of power and strategy, where control was everything and reputations were built. However, there was only one reason Adrian was here tonight: Elena. As soon as she entered the grand ballroom, silence fell over the crowd. Conversation stilled, glasses paused midair, and every gaze turned toward the entrance. She was breathtaking, dressed in a champagne-colored gown that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, the fabric hugging her curves in all the right places. She looked like a goddess. And when Adrienne's sharp gaze dropped lower to the gentle swell of her belly, where his twins were growing, his entire body tightened with a deep primal possessiveness. She was carrying his children. She was his wife, his woman. He and other men were spending an excessive amount of time and attention on her. Adrian ignored the moaning crowd and snapped admiringly from within. Ignoring the business associates vying for his attention, he crossed the room without hesitation, his strides powerful, uncompromising, and predatory. His entire attention was focused on just one person, his Elena. As he approached her, she turned, her delicate features glowing with warmth. "Adrian," she greeted softly, her voice sending shivers down his spine. His arms were already around her, his grip firm but gentle, pulling her against him. His gaze dropped to her stomach. "You're tired," he murmured, his deep, velvety voice. Elena sighed with worry. "Adrian, I just got here." He didn't care. The idea of her standing for too long, of her exerting even the smallest amount of energy when she should be resting, made something tighten in his chest. His arm wrapped even more tightly around her waist, securing her in front of everyone. And then he looked around at the men in the crowd, who had dared to admire her, who had let their eyes linger on what belonged to him, and without hesitation, without a warning, Adrian Sinclair leaned in and gave her a slow, deep, and controlling kiss. Kiss right there is in front of everyone. A gasp rippled through the room, the sound of shocked whispers and murmur filled the air. Cameras flashed, the entire world had just witnessed something previously unheard of. Adrian Sinclair, the aloof and untouchable CEO, losing control over a woman. But Adrian, he didn't care, because in that moment nothing else existed. Just Elena, just the way she melted, her lips parted in shock as she melted into him, before giving in to his possessive demand exactly the way his hand did. Sped across her lower back, holding her against him, as if he had never intended to release her, and when he finally did, broke the kiss. His gaze was dark and burning with an emotion so fierce, yet he turned just enough to look at the crowd, leaving Elena breathless. It was clear that she was mine, and no one in that room would dare look at her. The drive back to the penthouse that night was still silent. Elena could, the way his hands had held her like a possession, as if she were something he would never let anyone take away. The entire world had just witnessed it, Adrian Sinclair, the man who never showed emotion in public, the man who never let anyone see beyond his ruthless mask had. She was still unsure of her reaction as soon as they entered, despite the fact that they had just claimed her in front of everyone. Penthouse. She turned to him, her heart racing. Adrian? He didn't let her finish with one. He quickly pressed her against the nearest wall, encircling her. With his strong arms, his blue eyes burned into hers. Elena, he murmured, his voice low and rough. I need you to understand something. She swallowed hard. What his hands came up to cup her face, his touch unbearably tender. This isn't just a contract anymore. He whispered, her breath caught his thumb, brushed over her cheek. His expression was vulnerable and raw in a way that she had never seen before. I don't just want you as my wife on paper, he continued, his voice breaking slightly. I want all of you. Elena's heart pounded so hard it hurt Adrian. She choked emotion thick in her throat. His lips barely grazed hers, his breath warm, his. He murmured, tell me this isn't just a deal for you, as his hands slightly trembled against her skin. You're mine. Any more tears burned in her eyes because deep down she already knew the truth. She was his, and she would always be his. Elena had been resisting her feelings. For far too long at first it had seemed like the logical thing to do. Keep her heart, kept her distance from Adrian's overwhelming emotions. Sinclair stirred within her. She had told herself that their marriage was just a contract, a means to an end, a deal that made sense for both of them, especially. With the babies on the way, Adrian was only acting the way he did because of the twins. That's all, but deep down she knew the truth. She could deny it all she wanted, but there was no escaping the undeniable fact that she had already fallen in love with him. Adrian Sinclair, brutal, untouchable billionaire, who had entered her life as her husband, but had gradually become everything to her. One person she couldn't imagine life without, the man who, with every passing her heart, was being taken from her day by day, and there was no going back. Elena awoke to the soft glow of morning light streaming through the curtains, the peaceful silence of the penthouse surrounding her. The previous night felt like a dream, a whirlwind of emotions, passion, and unexpected declarations of love. But when she opened her eyes, she saw something that made her feel immediately heart race. Adrian. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, fully dressed in his usual crisp white shirt, in perfectly tailored black pants, his dark hair slightly tousled from the night before. But unlike every other morning, when he would have been long gone headed to his meetings or he was just sitting there this morning, which made the office different. Staring at her, his blue eyes were soft but still intense, tracing every inch of her face as if he was memorizing it, as if he needed to capture this moment forever. Morning. Elena whispered, her voice still heavy with, as he leaned in, sleep. Adrian smiled, the warmth in his eyes making it impossible to ignore, brushing a strand of hair away from her cheek with the tenderness that had started to take over his every action when it came to her. You're beautiful in the mornings, he said, his voice low. Her heart skipped a little bit at his words, and she swallowed, suddenly feeling a little bit in love with him. Overwhelmed, this was the same man who had built empires, who controlled everything around him with ruthless precision. But here he was, demonstrating her vulnerability in such a way for a man who had once, she asked, are you going to work? Untouchable was now pouring out a tenderness she had never anticipated, gently attempting to shift the conversation's focus, while still attempting to reconcile with the man before her, with the cold CEO she knew him to be. Adrian's lips curved into a sly smirk. I canceled my meetings. Her eyes widened in surprise. You canal your meetings. Adrian, you never do that. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed a light kiss on her forehead as he leaned closer. And when he pulled back, his gaze locked onto hers. You're more important, he said simply. Her breath caught in her throat. He was serious. This wasn't about the contract anymore. It was not about their deal, the babies, or anything else that had previously kept them apart. Rather, it was about them, and for the first time, Elena realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one falling in love. Elena found herself standing in the nursery that Adrian had designed for their twins. It wasn't finished yet. There were still soft pastel colors on the walls, delicate cribs waiting to be filled, and shelves lined with tiny stuffed animals waiting for the babies to arrive. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch one of the tiny onesies neatly folded in a drawer, feeling the weight and softness of the fabric. Made her chest tighten. She had spent so long convincing herself that this marriage, this life they were building together was that it was just a means to an end. But standing in this room surrounded by the future they were creating together, Elena realized that her heart couldn't keep lying to her. This wasn't just about a contract. She didn't want this to end. She didn't want to walk away from this man, from this family they were starting. She wanted Adrian not as her CEO, not as the man who had married her for a deal, but as her husband, her partner, her forever. The truth, which she had tried to conceal for far too long, settled deeply within her heart. She was in love with Adrian Sinclair, and there was nothing she could do to deny it any longer. When Adrian returned home that evening, Elena was waiting for him in their bedroom. She stood near the window, her hands nervously clasped together in front of her. The light from the setting sun cast a soft glow on her face, and for a moment Adrian just stood there watching her. Elena. He murmured, his voice a little softer than usual. She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest as if she had a secret she could no longer keep. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Adrian's eyes darkened, his brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" Her breath caught, her mind racing. Could she really say the words out loud? Could she really admit to Adrian that she had fallen in love with him? That she wanted a future with him, not just as his wife, but as his woman? His equal, his everything. "I love you, Adrian," she whispered, her voice shaky but resolute. There was a long, heavy silence. For the first time in their marriage, the powerful CEO was speechless. Elena's blue eyes slightly widened, as if the words she had just said had completely caught him off guard. Heart raced, her chest tightening with the fear that maybe he didn't feel the same. But before she could finish what she'd been about to say, Adrian was suddenly in front of her, his lips crashing onto hers in a kiss so deep, so consuming, that it stole the air from her lungs. This wasn't just a kiss of possession, not just a kiss to prove a point or to claim her as his own. This kiss was raw, aching, full of love, a love that neither of them could hide anymore. When he finally pulled away, resting his forehead on hers, his breath coming in, shallow gasps, his hands gently cued her face, as if he was afraid she might disappear. "Elena," he whispered, his voice hoarse, raw with emotion. "Say it again." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she kissed him again, her hands trembling as they ran through his hair. "I love you," she whispered again, this time with more. Adrian inhaled with greater conviction than ever before, as if those 3 words had completely undone him. He kissed her once more, desperately and feverishly, acting as though he never wanted to let her go. And Elena knew then, with absolute certainty, that Adrian Sinclair was a man of few words and even fewer promises. He never would. He was not one to make grand gestures or repeat himself. Every action he took had purpose and precision. Every decision was calculated, and every move was deliberate. However, when it came to Elena, the woman who had completely transformed his life, he was willing to break every rule he had set for himself for her. He would marry her again, not in secret this time, not as part of some contract that had once kept them apart, but for real, and this time it would be forever. It was a hidden plan, one that Adrian kept under wraps even from Elena. She had no idea what he was planning since her confession of love. He whispered soft praises against her skin, just as he had just left her side, kissed her gently every chance he could, and treated her as if she were his entire world, because in truth she was. He caressed her growing baby bump, a symbol of their future. But there was something about Adrian's actions lately that felt different. He was more attentive than usual. Yes, but he was also keeping something from her. He'd been making calls in private, speaking with his assistant in hushed tones, his face shadowed with concentration, as if there was something serious going on. Every time she inquired about the situation, he would simply smirk and advise her not to. As they sat, he would softly worry Elena, his hands grazing her stomach. Together in the penthouse, you trust me, don't you? The words, though simple, carried weight, and her heart would flutter in anticipation each time he said them, and her brow would furrow slightly as she replied, "Of course, but," and before she could ask more, he would cut her off, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "Then don't ask questions, just say yes when the time comes." Her heart would pound in her chest, and she would be left wondering what Adrian was planning, but she didn't press him further. If there was one thing she had learned about Adrian, it was that when he was determined to do something, he would do it no matter how much he kept it hidden. As the days passed, Elena found herself growing more curious about the mysterious events that seemed to be unfolding behind closed doors. Adrian continued to dot on her, lavishing her with affection, but his. She wasn't sure if it was a business or a surprise for the babies, and the secrecy only got worse. Deal or something else entirely. But she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had planned would change everything, and she couldn't help but a feeling of both excitement and anxiety, wondering if she was about to witness something that would read, "Define their love." And then one evening it happened. Adrian told her they were going out for dinner, but Elena had no idea that it would be different from any other night she had ever had. No expectations, no inkling of what he had up his sleeve. He led her out to the car, his hand holding hers gently as they made their way into the city. The drive felt like a blur, and by the time they arrived, Elena had no idea where they. When he opened the car door and helped her out, Adrian simply smiled at her. She followed him, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts until they reached the rooftop of a building. She had never been. Elena's breath caught in her throat prior to stepping onto the rooftop. The room was illuminated by warm, soft candlelight, which gave it a golden glow. Everything around them, the gentle music playing in the background, seemed to set the perfect tone, and the air was filled with the sweet fragrance of roses. The entire place was covered in thousands of roses, red, white, and pink, their petals soft and delicate, arranged in such a way that it appeared to be from a dreaming, that she was standing in the middle of it and couldn't believe her eyes. All was Adrian. He was dressed in his usual tailored black suit, but there was something different about him tonight. His eyes held a deeper emotion, something Elena couldn't quite place, something that made her heart skip a beat as she took in the sight of him standing there waiting for her. "Elena," Adrian called softly, his voice warm and inviting. He held out his hand to her, and she couldn't help but take a shaky step despite her confusion. Forward, drawn to him like a magnet, she inquired, her voice low. Adrian's lips curled into the tiniest smile, and his eyes sparkled with a mixture of amazement and disbelief as she approached him, sparkling with affection as he responded. As you can see, when she got to him, he gently took her hands in his thumb brushing across her skin, in a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. His touch was soft, yet there was an undeniable strength behind it, strength that had supported her through every challenge they had faced together. "Elena," he. As he first looked deeply into her eyes, he murmured in an emotional voice, "At the time I wed you, we were bound by a business agreement and a contract." He paused, his chest rising with a breath as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "But even then, I didn't realize I was marrying the love of my life." Her breath as she listened to him, she caught hold of the meaning in his words and felt them sink deeply into her heart and chest, eyes scanning his face for any indication that he was simply saying this out of obligation, or that there was something lingering responsibility. But there was no denying the sincerity in his gaze, and she knew that every word he was speaking came from the deepest parts of him. Even then, he continued, his voice. I didn't notice him dropping lower as he slowly got down on one knee in front of her. "Realize how much you would come to mean to me, how much I would need you, how much I would love you." Elena gasped as she saw him reach into his pocket, pulling out a small, elegant box. Her hands trembled as he opened it to reveal a dazzling diamond ring that shone like a star in the candlelight. Was the most stunning thing she had ever seen. "Seen this time," Adrian said softly, his voice filled with passion and love. I'm not asking as your CEO. I'm not asking as the individual with whom you signed a contract." Looked up at her, his blue eyes full of nothing but love and longing. I'm asking tears immediately welled up as the man who is in love with you forever and ever. This was the last chance Elena had, and her eyes lit up with emotion. This was the moment Adrian was finally making it a reality, something he had always desired. He wasn't just her husband on paper anymore. He was asking her to be his wife forever, Elena Sinclair. He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Will you marry? This time, I mean it. Elena's heart was bursting. She couldn't say the words because they were stuck in her throat, but tears were already pouring down her face and she couldn't stop them. She fell to her knees in front of him, trembling her hands around his face, and whispered, Yes, Adrian, 1,000 times. Times, yes, a deep, relieved groan escaped from Adrian's lips, and before she knew it, his lips were on hers, kissing her, as if he never wanted to stop, his arms wrapped around her, pulling. She drew closer to him as they sank into a kiss, and as the world faded, there was no one else around. Only them, only their love. And when Adrian finally slid the ring onto her finger, pressing a reverent kiss to her hand, Elena knew she had never been more certain of anything in her life. She was his forever. Elena had never believed in fairy tales. She had always seen them as stories meant to entertain, not as something that could in the real world. Her life had never been easy, and the concept of a perfect romance seemed like a fantasy that only existed in books or on movie screens. She had always been practical, grounded in the realities of her world. But now as she stood here, dressed in the most stunning wedding gown she had ever seen, made of delicate layers of silk and lace and intricate beadwork that sparkled in the grand hall's lighting, made her realize that she was living the life of a fairy. Tale, the love of her life, was standing at the altar waiting for her, and the entire world was witnessing the most beautiful and unexpected transformation of a cold-hearted, ruthless CEO into a man hopelessly in love with her. This was it. This was her. The wedding of Adrian Sinclair, and Elena was not like any other. Affair, the entire world had already known about their secret marriage, the one that had been based on a business, contract and hidden behind closed doors, but this time they were witnessing something far more profound. It was a union built on love, trust, and a deep understanding of one another. A love that had transformed into something pure from something complicated and unexpected. Something that will last forever. The ceremony took place on a private estate that appeared. It was a venue that whispered elegance and wealth with towering ceilings, looking like it belonged in the pages of a magazine. Columns, sprawling gardens, and chandeliers that seemed to glow like stars in the night sky. Every guest, from billionaires to celebrities, from the most influential people in the world to those who had simply been touched by the magic from the story of Adrian and Elena, gathered to witness this significant occasion. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and there wasn't a single soul present who was not completely enthralled by the scene. But Elena didn't see any of them. She didn't care about the opulence or the grandeur of the event. All she could see, all she could focus on, was the man waiting for her at the altar. Adrian, he stood there looking more handsome than ever in his tailored black tuxedo. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, were locked on her as she walked down the aisle, and there was an intensity in his gaze that sent shivers down her spine. It was as if he couldn't believe this was happening, as if he had to pinch himself to make sure it was real. Elena's, with each step she took in his direction, her heart pounded, her hands shook, and her breath caught in her throat as she drew closer. The world around her seemed to fade away until there was only Adrian and the deep connection they shared when she finally reached him. Her legs felt weak, but his strong hands steadied her, taking hers in his with a tenderness that made her heart ache his. As if he never wanted to let her go, his touch was tender and possessive. "You're stunning, Adrian," whispered his voice thick with emotion as he looked her up and down, taking in the sight of her in her wedding gown. Elena smiled, her heart racing. She couldn't find the words to respond because no words could adequately express how she felt in this moment. Adrian's eyes were full of love, full of admiration, and for a moment Elena forgot about everything else. She forgot about the guests, the cameras flashing, the world watching them. In that moment, there was only Adrian. The vows came next, but Elena could not contain the overwhelming feelings that were coursing through her. Adrian already composed his vows, But when it came time for him to speak, he did not simply recite them from a piece of paper. He took her hands into his and stroked her knuckles as he looked at her with all his sincerity. His voice, which he made with his thumb, was raw and full of devotion that Elena had never known. Expected of him, but that she had grown to adore Elena. Ever since I secretly wed you, Adrian began his. I didn't know what to make of his emotion-filled voice as he paused and clenched his jaw, as if his words were too much to bear. But now I do because you are my home, my everything, and my heart. She burst into tears at his words because she had known from the moment they first met that Adrian was special, but she never imagined that he would become the love of her life in such an extraordinary way. I vow to love, he added, his voice cracking. You guard, you treasure you for the rest of my life. Slightly as he spoke the words that would bind them together forever, Elena could barely speak through her tears, but she managed to find her voice when it was her turn to say her vows, her words coming from the deepest part of her. Hard as the incompetent declared them to be married, the entire world appeared to fall away. Everything felt like a dream, and in that moment Adrian pulled her into his arms, his lips colliding with hers in a passionate kiss. Love that was so promising that everyone in the audience gasped. There was no way to hide it. Adrian Sinclair, the ruthless CEO who once held his heart, has no more secrets, was now imprisoned and hopelessly in love with his wife, and the entire world knew it. Months passed, and Elena's life took on a new rhythm. She and Adrian had built a life of love, laughter, and the joy of their growing family. But nothing could have prepared Adrian for it. For the time being, the moment when the day had come for the twins, and Elena and Adrian were in the delivery room. His normally calm and collected demeanor was completely shattered as he paced outside. He was a man who was always in control, always confident in his ability to handle any situation, but today he was losing his mind. She's been in there too long, he muttered, his voice tight with, irritated. Why haven't they called his assistant, whose assistant had seen Adrian leave? Despite numerous stressful circumstances, I simply sighed, Sir, it's normal. A little Adrian couldn't take it any longer. His heart was beating faster and faster. He couldn't sit still any longer, and then just when he thought he might lose his mind, the sound he had been waiting for pierced the air. A baby's cry followed by another. His heart stopped. A nurse rushed out, beaming with joy. Mr. Sinclair, your family is safe. You can enter right away. Adrian didn't wait a second longer. He stormed into the room, his eyes landing on Elena, who was cradling two tiny newborns in her arms. His breath hitched in his throat as he took in the sight. She was exhausted, her face pale, but her eyes were full of love and joy. Adrian, she whispered, tears in her eyes, meet our babies. His heart swelled, and as he got closer, his hands trembled as he touched their newborn daughter's tiny fingers. Was so small and perfect, he murmured. She looks like you. His voice thick with emotion, his eyes never leaving her face. Elena smiled, her heart full of love. And he resembles you. Their baby boy is an exact copy of Adrian, felt a surge of pride and love unlike any other as she held Adrian in her arms. Everything he had ever known, including his family, was in this place. Wanted, he pressed a gentle kiss to Elena's forehead, his arms wrapping around her and their babies. I love you, he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. Thank you for giving me everything I never knew I needed. Elena smiled, her head resting against his shoulder as she held their children close. I love you too, Adrian, forever. And in that moment, as Adrian held Elena and their newborn twins, he knew without a doubt that he had finally found his happily ever after, the love of his life. The family he had always dreamed of was in his arms, and he wouldn't let go of it.